Hi, folks. Hopefully you can hear me. This is Wyatt Cross, the director of the Montana Water Center. Can I ask everyone first to just, if you can, mute your side? You should have something on your screen that has a little microphone on it. If you click on that, just mute. And of course, if you need to chime in, just unmute yourself and we'll go from there. Okay, so this is really exciting. This working group represents our first technical working group as part of something we're calling the Montana Water Consortium. And just very briefly, the Montana Water Consortium is a brand new effort at the Water Center where we're trying to strengthen and re-energize connections between the Montana University system and all the other important water resource stakeholders in the state. And basically what we're trying to do is leverage the knowledge and expertise that exists around the state to provide knowledge and unbiased synthesis about our most pressing water resource issues. And so the topic of this first working group is irrigation efficiency and water conservation. This was a natural extension of discussions that occurred at the Montana Water Summit, the DNRC's Montana Water Summit last year. And we think it's a topic that deserves some serious attention. But basically the big picture is that changes in irrigation practices that are geared towards increasing efficiency are often assumed to both increase agricultural production and save water for other beneficial uses. But there's a growing understanding that increased efficiencies at the individual farm scale might actually lead to increased consumptive use of water. And of course, there are lots of complexities of this issue, but also great opportunities to work on how to use and manage our irrigation water to best sort of maximize benefit for everyone at multiple scales. And so we're really hoping by the end of this working group that we'll have some more clarity on this issue and specifically how it applies to Montana. First, I just want to thank everybody so much for your time and for your interest in participating in this working group. Just with respect to the hydrologists that we have on the line now, or the first component of this project, we have excellent representation across the state, including state and federal agencies, universities, tribes, NGOs, consulting firms, and so on. So we're super thankful for all of your participation. I also want to thank the other organizers of this working group, so Whitney Lonsdale, the Assistant Director of the Montana Water Center, as well as Ann Schwend and Sarah Malloy at the DNRC, who have worked hard to help us put this together. This next slide just shows a list of the participants for this first hydrology component, and this is really good representation. This list is going to grow as we enter into other important disciplines or perspectives that are influenced by changes in irrigation. And so as we move to the next part of this working group, this will include people from policy realms, economics, social scientists, and so on. So our goal, so where are we headed with this working group? The big goal is basically what we plan to do is develop and distribute a publication, something that's really accessible and translational, that examines the state of the science, that helps identify knowledge gaps, and basically lays out the first steps of a decision-making framework to help better inform irrigation water management. And how we're proposing to get there is by taking a few steps. The first, of course, is this webinar. And the goals for today's webinar are simply to frame the issue and hear about a really interesting example from Idaho to get us all collectively thinking about this issue. After this, we're going to have in March, on March 7th in Helena, we're going to have a meeting from 10 to 3 p.m. and we'll send out more information about this after today. But our goal there is to dig in further in terms of what we know, what we don't know, in terms of irrigation hydrology in Montana, and try to come to some sort of consensus on terms, on themes, knowledge gaps, and so on. After this, in April, in Bozeman, we plan to have a meeting that's going to help us round out the issue. Okay, so this is where we're going to bring in other critical components such as policy, economics, agriculture, and social science, and hear other perspectives on this problem. And then finally, in early May, we don't have a location for this yet, but we're planning a larger meeting that will basically solicit feedback and input from a larger group of stakeholders, citizens, and others around the state. And so again, I just want to reiterate, thanks so much for everybody's interest. I think this is going to be really, really productive. and we will be in touch with you throughout as we move forward. The next thing I want to do now is hand it over to Dr. Rob Van Perk. Rob is the Senior Scientist and Restoration Director at Henry's Fork Foundation. Rob has thought a ton about this topic, and he's going to share some interesting perspectives and lessons learned from the Upper Snake River. So let's see, I'll stop sharing my screen, and you should be able to take it away, Rob.
Okay, I'll try to get the screen sharing going here first. Okay, I think we're all good here. Audio okay, and everybody see everything?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks Wyatt, and thank you for the opportunity to present some of the work we've been doing over here that goes back, decades. I've been working on this problem for, I don't know, now it's been probably 15 years. So as Wyatt said, yeah, effective changes in irrigation practices, and I'm gonna, this is sort of case study from the Snake River basin, but informed by a lot of background literature review I've done and work really across the world on this issue. So kind of the four things I'm going to cover here: hydrology, a little bit about ecology, and then end up with administration and policy, really kind of to frame what Wyatt said, would be the next steps on this. So outline is, we've got a problem we've been trying to solve here in the Snake River Basin for 50 years. And I'll give a little introduction to the problem, to the geography. Irrigation efficiency, yeah, some definitions, some trends to get us all communicating in the same way. And then here's the ecology piece. And then Wyatt already sort of gave away the punchline on the paradox of irrigation efficiency, namely that it usually increases consumptive use. But as he also said, there's many factors that affect how efficiency changes, irrigation changes in general, are going to affect any given system. And so I've got kind of a list of things that need to be assessed in order to look at what potential effects might be in your particular basin. And then again, kind of end with administrative and policy aspects. And again, those are going to be really dependent on the administration in your state, really. I guess most water administration is done at the state level. In terms of the slides here, I've put a lot more information in a lot smaller font on these slides than I would for an in-person presentation, because you've got it sit in front of you on the screen. And so some of the slides I may not go into it as much detail, because you have a copy of them and can refer to it later. So Upper Snake River Basin is essentially the whole eastern part of Idaho. It's our major agricultural region in the state, about 2.1 million irrigated acres. It supports a $15 billion economy. Just to give you an idea of the kind of water we're talking about, 7.5 million acre feet a year are withdrawn from surface sources, and about a little over 1 million acre feet a year in groundwater withdrawals. I've identified a few geographic locations on the map that I'll refer to. So one is the Eastern Snake Plain, that essentially is the large regional aquifer in this area. Up at the headwaters, I've got two watersheds delineated here in yellow, the Upper Teton Basin, and then orange, the Henry's Fork watershed where I work. The reason for doing this is I'm going to show some statistics later on some of the irrigation efficiency parameters, groundwater recharge, to show you that these things scale up and down. So they go from the scale of a small headwater basin like the Teton to the entire region depicted on the large slide here. So those are just some watersheds I'll refer to. The Snake River, of course, originates over here on the eastern side of the Teton Range in the Jackson area, and then the river kind of makes a U-turn, comes into Idaho, and then this light-colored area on the image here is the irrigated lands And a couple other major points here, locations that are important. Milner Dam is an important location because it's the downstream most point of diversion of surface water in the upper Snake Basin. And that the point of diversion there is important because the river is essentially managed for zero flow to be in the river downstream of Milner. So all the water gets diverted out. You can see this big irrigated area here near Twin Falls. That's the Magic Valley, what we call it. And a lot of that water ends up back in the river at Thousand Springs, which is a major discharge point from the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And there's a gauge at the very left part of the stream gauge at the left part of the image here at King Hill. And that's the point at which we can close the water budget for this entire area depicted on the map because it's downstream of all the groundwater returns. It's a geologic constriction in the river, and so that's where the gauge at which we can actually do the entire accounting of both groundwater and surface water in the watershed. So those are just some places I'll refer to later on. This is kind of a schematic that illustrates the administrative issues, actually. So this brown area here, that's the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And there are a few really notable places. Here's this zero flow at Milner I referred to a minute ago, Thousand Springs discharge, where most of the groundwater comes back into the river. And one other really important piece of the Idaho story here is a power plant at Swan Falls Dam, which is just due south of downtown Boise. That's like 300 miles from here. And there's a water right there that has to be guaranteed regardless of what happens in the upper basin. So this is sort of the ultimate in basin-wide administration of water. So an agricultural producer here in Ashton is tied to this water right 300 miles downstream near Boise. And so the Swan Falls issue is something really important. I'll talk about it at the very end in terms of administration. But this just gives you an idea of the scale of the basin on which administration, a common set of water administration rules applies. It's really, really big. So if you go across the basin, trends in groundwater discharge are universally negative no matter where you look. And again, I've sort of picked out these three spatial scales and geologic types. So this top one, Silver Creek, most of you probably heard of this. It's a famous, trout fishery in its own right, and it's an example of a headwater basin alluvial aquifer, fairly shallow. The valley fill alluvium. It's similar to the kinds of aquifers you have in Montana. And the stream itself primarily is fed by discharge from that aquifer, and it's got a downward trend over the last 40 years. Box Canyon Spring is one of the Thousand Springs. It's one of the large ones with a long gauging record. And this was discharged from the regional aquifer here, which is basalt with interbedded sediments. This is kind of a typical situation in the Pacific Northwest where we have a lot of basalt. You don't have this so much in Montana. Nonetheless, this is a regional aquifer. And then the bottom graph is reach gains from groundwater to the lower Henry's Fork, which again is this sort of intermediate scale where the river interacts with the local alluvial aquifer, which can be perched in times and places, especially at the beginning of irrigation season when a lot of water goes into the aquifer in areas where transmissivity is pretty low. And the river is also connected to the regional aquifer. So again, kind of keep in mind these three spatial scales and geologic types. Of course, you look on the regional ESPA, and groundwater levels have been going down for a long, long time. And, in places, especially down at the southern part of the aquifer, water level declines on the order of 60 to 100 feet. And then in Idaho, this is the infamous graph that everybody shows in every water presentation you ever see here in the state. So if you haven't seen this thing before, we look at this all the time, and it's to the point where you don't even have to look at it, we just say, hey, we're going to show that Thousand Springs graph. Basically, this graph charts sort of the history of the aquifer in both volume, which is the solid black line, and discharge at Thousand Springs, which are the bars, from the early 20th century up till now. And the pattern's pretty obvious here, that the aquifer gained a lot of water and discharge increased all the way up till the mid 50s, and since then has been on a more or less declining trajectory, reflecting wet and dry cycles in the climate, obviously, but nonetheless pretty much on a decline since the mid 50s. So I'll just jump right to the reasons for groundwater decline without any further ado on that. Obviously, increased groundwater pumping is an issue. In the 1950s, groundwater irrigation was developed across the plain, and there's no question that increased groundwater pumping has contributed to the decline of the aquifer and aquifer discharge. However, increased irrigation efficiency, if you actually do the numbers, it has a greater effect over the long run, and I'll show you some data in a few minutes to kind of justify that conclusion. But in any case, increased irrigation efficiency has played a very major role for groundwater declines, especially in the headwater basins where we don't have a lot of groundwater pumping. Conversion from flood irrigation to sprinklers, and from ditch irrigation and conveyance to pipe conveyance. And then a third piece, which is not a big deal regionally, but locally can have very large effects, and that is loss of irrigated agricultural land to subdivisions. This photo is in Teton Valley, where we've had a replacement of about 25% of the irrigated ag land to non-agricultural uses, and two things happen there. You know, when you take the irrigation off the land, the irrigation seepage is lost, but on the other hand, most of the domestic use is groundwater pumping, so it increases pumping at the same time it's reducing recharge. So anyway, that's an issue that we have in spots. The Boise area is another place, Teton Valley, and I know this is an issue that you have in many places in Montana. So here's the big list of terminology. These terms are not universally defined in these ways, but pretty close if you look in papers on the subject. I'm not going to carefully go through everything here, but the important points here: withdrawal is the amount of water diverted from the stream or pumped from the aquifer, and that's an important quantity to be distinguished from consumptive use down here. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir on this, but when I give talks to more lay audiences, that is a real issue that a lot of people have a hard time with. What's the difference between water that is withdrawn versus water that is consumptively used? So consumptive use, I'm calling water loss to evapotranspiration, evaporation, transpiration, and actually harvest. You know, you pull a bunch of potatoes out of the ground and remove them from the system. They have a lot of water in them, so that's over and above the water used by the plants during the growing season. I should also mention that consumptive use isn't always beneficial consumptive use, because water lost to evaporation, say from sprinklers or from a reservoir surface, that's water that's consumptively used but not in a beneficial way. So the efficiencies I've got down here at the bottom: conveyance, application, total, and system. So conveyance efficiency is just fraction of the withdrawal that you actually get to the place of use. Application efficiency is the fraction of what's delivered to the place of use that actually gets used in crop production. And I also include soil moisture in that, because you've got to have some amount of soil moisture retention for the crops to grow anyway, so that's included in there. So then the total efficiency would just be the fraction of the water withdrawn from the source that actually ends up directly contributing to crop growth and maintenance of the soil moisture necessary to do that. System efficiency is a different critter, and a lot of this term is not quite as universally defined this way, but there's system efficiency is actually the efficiency in delivering and applying the desired amount of water at the right places and the right times. And that water may be used for things like managed aquifer recharge, but nonetheless, getting the water from the source to where you're going to use it as efficiently as possible is a different thing than the actual irrigation efficiency, but it's a term that we use more often as we're trying to install and use more efficient, if you will, delivery mechanisms like automated head gates and things like that. So I kind of touched on some of this stuff, but in the interior West, these things are pretty universal. In the 19th to mid-20th century, canal ditch and surface application dominated irrigation practices. Generally, hay, grain, and pasture were irrigated by just direct flooding, just sheet flooding across the field. Row crops don't work that way, but furrow irrigation was generally used on the row crops. World War II came along, and there was a source of a lot of excess cheap electricity after that and technology. So that's when groundwater pumping really came into widespread use. And generally, when those groundwater pumps were put in, the conveyance is in pipes. So you automatically have a much more efficient situation with groundwater than you do with surface water. Then through the 70s and 90s, and I'll show a graphic with some data on it in a minute here, the flood and furrow application was replaced by sprinklers. And along at the same time, many canals were replaced by pipelines, but that wasn't universal. And drip irrigation, which is sort of the ultimate in efficiency in terms of application, that's really rare except on fruit and nut crops. Of course, out in Central Valley, California, they use a lot of drip irrigation and almost get to 100% irrigation efficiency. Here in Idaho, about the only place you'll see this is in our, we have some fruit and nut growing over in the western part of the state, especially in our Snake River Valley wine region. Drip irrigation is used in those vineyards. In the upper Snake Basin as a whole, about 90% of that 7 million acre-foot surface withdrawal is still delivered in the 19th century unlined canal system. However, about 90% of it is applied with sprinklers. So we're sort of partway through the efficiency conversion in the sense that the application is almost exclusively sprinkler, but the conveyance is almost exclusively delivered in unlined canals. So we sort of have a hybrid. And typical efficiencies, and this is from direct field research that we've done here in the Snake Basin, plus looking at literature from other places. Generally, efficiency in unlined canal conveyance is 50 to 80%, depends on the local soils and geology. Around here, it's about 50%. And you can get 80 to 90, almost 100% for lined canals and pipelines. On the application end, sprinklers are 90-95% efficient with the loss due to evaporation, although you can still over irrigate with sprinklers and end up with excess application that beyond what the plants can use. Application efficiencies for surface methods 60 to 90%, but you put all that together and that means that your efficiency for a system with canal conveyance and surface application is about 30 to 75%. Around here, it's typically 40-ish, 50-ish. When you go to canal sprinkler, you're in the 45 to 75% efficiency range. And then if you get a pipe sprinkler system, you can get up to 95% efficiency. And if you go to the drip, which we don't really have here very much, you can get essentially 100% efficiency. I've looked at irrigation systems in California, and it's 99%, if not 100%. So schematically and sort of from a landscape perspective, I call these things, hydro ecosystems and irrigated landscapes. And I'm, part of the research I do is actually looking at ecology and also sociology in these landscapes and viewing them as ecosystems. They're not what was here 200 years ago, but they do function, and they're a lot of the landscape here in eastern Idaho anyway. And, sort of schematically, you got precipitation, you got mountains retaining snow melt. We're in the same boat as you are. Most of our water supply is snow melt, and that water makes its way down into the stream system, and then canals divert water from the stream system, and the whole while, all this is interacting with the aquifer. So the stream channels, some of them contribute a lot of water through seepage, especially streams that flow out of the mountains onto big alluvial fans. I know you have a lot of that in Montana, so you lose a lot of surface water from the natural stream channel. The same thing happens in the canal system. A lot of that water ends up in the aquifer. Depending on the application of irrigation to the crops, you get seepage there. And then, of course, this water is coming back into the river, back into wetlands, in locations where you have emergence of groundwater. And then, of course, there's discharge from the aquifer through pumping. And I mentioned the 1.2 million acre feet that are withdrawn from in the upper basin for agriculture, but domestic uses and municipal uses are important as well, because our municipal domestic supply comes exclusively from groundwater here. So even though the amount that's withdrawn for domestic and municipal use is very small, it's really important part of the hydrology, because those uses depend on the water table being fairly high, so that the cost of pumping it is fairly low. And these photographs around the edges are just typical, views in the landscapes we have around here. A lot of this should look familiar to you all in Montana. And the picture in the lower left, a couple of my graduate students, that's a canal. It's not a stream channel. And I put this in to illustrate that, defining what's a stream, what's a canal, what's natural, what's not is really fuzzy in these landscapes. Just like the one in the upper right corner, that's actually return flow, partly from irrigation, partly from that natural discharge. But in any case, these are what the landscapes look like here. So here's some data for a bit here. These represent fractions of the surface water diverted and its fate here. And this is, again, those three spatial scales: Upper Teton, which is a headwater basin and an alluvial aquifer; Henry's Fork, that's our sort of intermediate scale watershed; and the whole basin. And you can see that the patterns are pretty transferable across spatial scales. So the vast majority, the majority of water diverted from the surface system ends up back in the surface system via groundwater pathways. Those are the green bars. 50 to 75% of the surface water diverted ends up back in the river. The crop evapotranspiration component you can see is down here, 30, 40, 45%. So that's the actual crop production per unit of surface water diverted. There's a little bit we have that returns via surface flow. That's the blue stuff. We don't have a lot of drains here, so there's not a whole lot of direct surface return. In other places in western Idaho, we do have a lot more drains, so there's a greater fraction of that component and a little lower fraction on the groundwater return. One interesting thing here is the evaporative loss from our irrigation systems here is tiny. It's just a few percent, mostly from sprinkler loss, but it's a very minor part of the water budget here. So if you have that much water going into aquifers from irrigation seepage, it has to be a large component of groundwater recharge, and indeed it is. This varies a little more across geology and geography. Generally at the headwater areas, the stream channel seepage is about the same as irrigation seepage, if not a little more. And this is that situation where we have streams coming out of the mountains and flowing across deep alluvial fan deposits. And again, you have that situation throughout Montana. As you go to the larger scales, then irrigation, of course, makes up a larger fraction of the total recharge. And this is something I've looked at across the entire western United States, and pretty much everywhere there is irrigated agriculture. At least 20% of the total recharge to local and regional aquifers comes from irrigation seepage. Okay, switch to ecology just for a couple slides here. Obviously, if you've got all this groundwater influence in the hydrologic system, coupled with diversion of water from the surface system during the early part of the summer, it's going to drastically change the shape of your stream hydrograph. And so these two graphs here come from some hydrologic model I've done in the Teton Basin, and just a simplest way to measure the degree of groundwater influence is to look at the ratio of the maximum peak discharge to the minimum base flow discharge. And sort of under natural conditions, you can see the Teton River, this would be an unregulated situation, sort of pre-European settlement, relatively low base flows, high peak flows during snowmelt runoff. This is sort of the natural hydrology of these basins, and this should look familiar to you. You have the same sort of hydrologic regimes in Montana. So the red dashed line here is my reconstruction through modeling of what the river would have looked like under flood irrigation when it was in full practice, which would have been sort of last in the early 70s or something, the last time we had full flood irrigation. And of course, the maximum is much lower because all that water is getting diverted, but the minimum comes up because half of that diverted water ends up back in the stream via groundwater pathways. And of course, the attenuation and lag time allows that recharge to be distributed and realized in stream discharge throughout the whole year. And so the maximum's lower, the minimum's higher, and this changes the whole hydrograph from one of being snowmelt dominated to more of a groundwater dominated system. And I should mention, I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of this, it's a separate talk, but that change to a hydrograph that was not the one there present prior to European settlement, that's not a natural hydrologic regime, and of course it's going to have negative consequences for a lot of native species that have evolved around that more flashy snowmelt hydrologic regime, especially in the presence of non-natives. And we see this in terms of competition and hybridization between non-native rainbow trout that have been introduced and native cutthroat trout, and that groundwater hydrologic regime shift has a lot to do with that. So that's all I'm going to say about ecology, except to point out that irrigation seepage has been a big part of our hydrologic system in these areas for well over 100 years. And that's the system we have now. It's not the one that was here pre-European settlement, but it's what we have. It serves a lot of functions. Improved water quality, the groundwater returns are cooler in the late summer. There's a lot of riparian wetland habitat associated with emergent groundwater and also with the canals themselves. We have a lot of riparian habitat that's quite functional for birds and other wildlife along the canals themselves. A couple other things, flood control, sort of a natural flood control mechanism when a lot of the water's diverted from streams during runoff and put out on the ground. There's sort of a natural storage mechanism here. And then the last two are really important in terms of the efficiency discussion. The higher groundwater table allows municipal and domestic use at lower cost because the wells don't have to be that deep. And then, of course, supply for downstream users. The way the water rights were claimed around here, if water was available, it was claimed, and by the time some of it was claimed, a lot of that was return flow from the people who'd already claimed water upstream. Here's a little bit of data on the timing of conversion from flood to sprinkler. It's actually fairly recent, kind of late 70s when it really got going, and the majority of conversion, at least here in the Upper Snake Basin, occurred in the early to mid 1980s. And those programs were actually kind of set in motion during the Carter administration under a lot of conservation programs. NRCS in particular funded a lot of conversions. So the programs were kind of instituted in the 70s, but didn't really get on the ground until the early to mid 80s. And by, 2000-ish, 2005-ish, 10-ish, we were at our sort of 90% sprinklers and kind of flatlined at that level. Concurrent with that, you look at total diversion. So the graph on the right is from our watershed, but this is universal. I could have picked any watershed or the entire Snake Basin, and this is what diversion has done. It's decreased about 20-30% over the last 40 years, and the decline has been exactly commensurate with the increase in irrigation efficiency. So less water is being diverted from the streams to the, like I say, tune of 20-30%. However, if you look at the whole basin, this is a graph that needs a little bit of explanation. So what I've done here is look at the outflow at King Hill. Remember, that's that point at the very bottom of our system where we can close the water budget. And so this is the ratio of that discharge to the inflow to the system from the Snake River headwaters as it comes out of Wyoming that I showed on that earlier map. That inflow from the Snake River is about 50% of the total inflow to the whole system. There's other tributaries, obviously, but it's highly correlated. So it's essentially a measure of water supply. So we're basically looking at the ratio of outflow to inflow, and that was pretty flat all the way up until the mid 1980s. And yeah, there were ups and downs related to climate. Mostly there was a dry period, in the 30s, and some weather periods and dry periods. You can see those climate cycles. However, the trend was flat despite the big increase in groundwater withdrawals that occurred in the mid 1950s. The real decline didn't start until sometime in the 80s, when the effect of the irrigation efficiency conversions really took hold. So this is one of many pieces of data we have that show that the irrigation efficiency component of this is a stronger driver of what's going on hydrologically than the groundwater pumping. And of course, the only thing you can infer here, there's less water coming out per unit of water going in, and that is that, well, we've decreased diversion a lot, yet there's less water in the river. And this is the paradox, of course, that increased efficiency almost always increases consumptive use unless there's some sort of administrative or economic mechanism to prevent that from happening. And there's basically three reasons that this happens. One is at the farm level, just more uniform and precise application that you can obtain with sprinklers versus flooding. That's just going to increase yield per acre at the farm level. And this is just, the consequence of putting in a sprinkler system without the farmer even really doing anything else other than putting the sprinkler in there. There's the increased yield is going to happen without really any intent or intentional change on the part of the farmer other than just switching irrigation. On the next one here is that then this sort of gets the administrative part in here. In prior appropriation, there is the forfeiture feature, the use it or lose it. Different states, approach that differently, of course, but that's pretty universal in prior appropriation. That incentivizes continued diversion of the full right, no matter whether you need the water or not, which means, well, I've got the same amount of water to divert, but I get more of it to the crop. And so there's an incentive for the water rights holder, for the farmer, to switch to higher value crops. If we've got the water to do it, then you might as well grow higher value crops if that's possible. Around here, pretty much that's been a switch from grain, barley and wheat that doesn't take all that much water, to potatoes and even more so to feed crops like feed corn and alfalfa that use a lot more water, 2 to 3 times more than the grain did. And now with efficiency, producers have that extra water to use, so they'll do it. And then there's this sort of larger scale thing that happens that you have to look basin wide to see this, like I showed you in that last graph. And that is that water that's not diverted within a subwatershed or an irrigation entity under prior appropriation, of course, that water is available to the next junior user. And so a junior user that may have run short on water in previous irrigation systems now has access to more water than prior to that. So that user is able to irrigate more land more often, or again, use higher value crops. And so consumptive use goes up because more people are using more water on higher value crops. So those are kind of the three, main reasons why efficiency increases consumptive use. This last one I put in here because it just shows that, this whole story of the paradox of irrigation efficiency is a unintended consequences study. That's exactly what it is. And here's one that we're discovering now. Low elevation sprinkler application is starting to become more widely used around here because it can save water, and it does definitely decrease evaporative loss. You can get that evaporative loss down to less than 1%. However, if you look on the large scale, it turns out that evaporative cooling from large areas of sprinkler use reduces the total evapotranspiration downwind and across the entire agricultural region, so that when you reduce cooling in one place by more efficient sprinklers, then the ET actually goes up on the field downstream. And I actually have we have an intern who's going to do a field study on this summer here to actually try to get some numbers in our area of how this actually works on a grain crop. So the message there is just everything has a consequence, and generally you don't think about it till it happens. Okay, so now kind of to get toward the end of the formal presentation, and kind of get us toward where Wyatt and Whitney and I have talked about where the group wants to go. Here's the stuff you have to really think about in terms of how is this going to actually work in a given watershed. So hydrogeology obviously is the obvious first place to look. Temporal and spatial response to aquifer recharge, where and when is that discharged, and how much water is lost to seepage. That's all dependent on the hydrogeology, and so that's really the first place to start. Water budgets obviously are important at multiple scales. A lot of times the negative effects of irrigation efficiency won't be realized, in other words, the increased consumptive use, until you step out far enough at the basin scale. Land use is an issue. I pointed out the issues we have with replacement of irrigated ag lands with non-agricultural use. That's a key component, and I know there are places in Montana where the change in land use is probably has as big of an effect as change in irrigation practices. Crop types are really important. I mentioned this concept that, reality that we see around here, producers who have more water available are switching to higher value crops. But there's a big question: can those crops be grown given the climate and soils in a particular location if there is more water available? If not, then making more water available may not actually change consumptive use all that much. But if you're in a situation where the higher value crops can be grown, then they will be, unless there's some incentive for the producers to do otherwise. Current irrigation methods, obviously, what are you going from and to? That's important. As I said, here we're sort of halfway through. We've got the canal conveyance with sprinkler application, and I think what we've learned so far and where our administration is headed is that we'll probably try to just keep it where it is right now and not take that next step of putting all the conveyance in pipes. And then there's these last two. One is, how important is the current groundwater discharge for domestic, commercial, municipal, and industrial use, and how much do downstream irrigators or downstream storage reservoirs depend on that groundwater return. So again, this is sort of back to the hydrogeology and the water budgets. And then lastly, and this is probably even more important in Montana than it is here in Idaho, are the ecological consequences of irrigation efficiency changes good or bad? What do you have right now in terms of aquatic resources? Have non-native fish already displaced natives, or do you still have natives? Those are a lot of consequences that really need to be addressed. And given the importance of recreational sport fishing in Montana, that's going to be probably even a more important issue to look at than here in Idaho. We have really important fisheries, obviously, but not many of them are in the irrigated landscapes. Most of them are in the headwater regions and are relatively unaffected by irrigation practices. Here's a big list. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but when I talk about this 50-year problem at the very beginning, and you talk about, okay, well, what are the consequences of not understanding and proactively managing changes in irrigation practices? Well, Idaho's a great place to look at that. This goes back to the 1970s, and at that time, the Water Resource Board was formed to establish a state water plan. And at that time, it was already realized that the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer was a critical part of the hydrology, that groundwater pumping was probably going to have some effect. And so the first big hydrogeologic studies of the aquifer were implemented clear back in the 70s. 1984, I mentioned this Swan Falls power plant. There was a settlement agreement. That's where this minimum flow came from. That's a water right that just has to be met regardless of what's going on 300 miles upstream here in Ashton. The idea was that the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer discharge would meet the minimum. That's partly how the minimum was determined. And if there was leftover, then that could be allocated to new groundwater irrigation, but it didn't take long. I mean, by 92, it was clear that there was no more water available for groundwater irrigation, and there was a moratorium placed on new groundwater irrigation. So groundwater irrigation is fixed at its 1992 level. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happened administratively, conjunctive management rules, a bunch of water calls, more planning documents, and so on and so on. One I will mention is in 2014, we finished the Snake River Basin adjudication. It took 27 years, but it's completely done, and it has some implications I'll talk about in a minute here. The Swan Falls minimum was violated in 2015 for the first time, and that cost the state some storage water to actually meet that for a few weeks in the middle of the summer. The last item that's really noteworthy here is this Surface Water Coalition groundwater user settlement that was reached in late 2015, and this actually requires the groundwater users to cut 240,000 acre feet per year or mitigate that through mostly managed aquifer recharge. Keep in mind that the groundwater withdrawal total is 1.2 million, so the 240,000 acre feet is not a trivial amount of water. So with all that in mind, you don't want to go through all that for 50 years, and we like to joke that all of that on the previous slide put an awful lot of water lawyers' kids through college over the years. And the lawyers tell that joke, so that's how we view that whole thing. But considerations not to go down that road or to go in a more positive direction right from what you all are trying to do right now. Here's some questions. Are groundwater and surface water conjunctively administered? And if so, how? Well, in Idaho, yeah. It's done via water calls, formal, administrative procedures within Department of Water Resources, in which a surface water user says, hey, the groundwater pumping is taking our flow away, and then there are settlements around that, and the tool is our groundwater models, and these are, in our state, kind of done by committee, fully vetted, so that at the end of a new model development or calibration, all the stakeholders agree on the model, and then until the next calibration, that model informs administration from then on. And everybody's already agreed on the rules, so there's no arguing over whose model is best at that point. Definition of beneficial use is important. Is seepage incidental to traditional practices considered within the beneficial use of the right? In Idaho, yeah, whatever was traditionally needed when the right was claimed to meet the irrigation demand, including conveyance, is part of the right. And if the right holder changes technology and it becomes more efficient and there's less seepage loss, that water still retains, is still part of the right. The user still has the right to divert that water. And this actually probably would be a little more, a little less certain had we not finished the adjudication. So once a water right has gone through that adjudication process, that's pretty much ironclad here at this point. There were a few rights that were reduced because the user could not show full diversion and beneficial use of the right, but that was rare. Most of the rights that are still being used have the exact same amount of waters when they were claimed, despite the switch to more efficient irrigation. So then the next, there's a couple issues. What do you do with that quote unquote extra water? So right now there's a big program to recharge the aquifer with managed aquifer recharge, and some rights holders have come back and said, well, hey, my canal is putting a whole bunch of water into the aquifer already. I can quantify that. Why don't I get credit for aquifer recharge? And the answer is just absolutely no. And there have been several court cases about this, and every time the water court has said, no, we're not going to do that. Your incidental recharge does not count for managed recharge. If you want to get credit for that, save that water somehow and then recharge it later. So anyway, this one is something a few canal companies still keep trying, and they just get denied every single time. Scale, of course, you got to look at what level are water rights being administered. Historically, Idaho was probably like most other western states. As long as the users within a local stream system or subwatershed got along, and the junior user and the person at the end of the canal got water and they all agreed, that was good enough. That is absolutely not the case in Idaho anymore. Idaho has moved from local to entire basin, if not entire state, by the time you throw in the Swan Falls agreement. And as a result of that, the department has ordered metering devices on every head gate, on every canal system in every basin, and the groundwater surface water settlement required metering on every groundwater pump in the entire basin. So administration now occurs at a highly precise level. Everybody knows how much water everybody's diverting every day, and the surface water, of course, is administered in real time based on that information. The groundwater administration, because of the nature of groundwater, of course, it's lagged in space and time just like the water itself, but we're getting closer and closer to actually administering groundwater in as real time as you can get, given the nature of groundwater flow. And then here's the other part of that administratively recoverable question earlier. Let's suppose that a user puts in irrigation efficiency and improves efficiency at the farm scale. Is there any way that producer can market the non-diverted part of the right, or is there any way that there's an incentive for the user to actually keep consumptive use at the same level, free up that water and market it some other way? This is kind of like, can you work cap and trade on this? And the answer is yes, but not very easily. In Idaho, we just don't have real progressive or liberal, if you will, leasing and marketing mechanisms that allow this. So right now, there's really not any incentive internally for a producer to put in irrigation efficiency and not take advantage of the increased crop production. So at the very last thing, this gets into the policies and, real conservation, meaning not just what appears to be conservation because the sprinkler system's more efficient, but I mean, real basin scale conservation. And this is exactly what Wyatt was talking about in the introduction here, trying to figure out how this, conservation works for all stakeholders at large scales. So one of the things we're doing right now is restoring canal and flood irrigation. This is actually, we actually have some federal money that's funding return to flood irrigation on systems that got federal money to put in sprinklers in the first place 40 years ago. And we're trying this out in Teton Valley, going to kind of a dual system where the water users are restoring their old ditches and flood areas so that when their natural flow rights are in priority and there's a lot of water in the stream system, they're diverting as much of their right as they can, putting it out on the ground, and then as soon as the natural flow rights go away and water use switches to storage water, then they switch back to pipes and sprinklers. This is kind of in its infancy. I think this is going to be just our second year of a program to do this. The first year was sort of learn that it's really hard to go restore the old ditches, but anyway, this is something we're trying. It's a good strategy. Managed aquifer recharge is the single biggest strategy in Idaho that's going on right now. There's sort of two flavors. One is natural flow, just diversion of water when it's in priority. Of course, unfortunately, all the managed aquifer rights are junior because nobody thought to claim these things until the last 30 years. So they're last in the line of priority. However, in years when there's extra water, during spring runoff, sometimes there's enough to meet all demand and have some left over. So that's when managed recharge is being done. Then there's another kind here, which gets toward the market question, and that is private use of rented storage water. So there's administrative mechanisms where storage users cannot use their storage, put it in a rental pool. The groundwater users can rent it, keep it in the reservoir all summer, and then deliver it during the off season for managed recharge, and they get mitigation credits that allow them to keep pumping groundwater. This is in its infancy. There's a lot of issues around that right now, but it's a potential tool to limit use of water during the irrigation season and divert it for recharge later on. Limit negative effects of agricultural land conversion. We have quite a few active land trusts in Idaho, as you do in Montana, and providing incentives to keep producers operating working lands. That's a win-win-win. It's a win for the producers. It's a win for fish and wildlife and open space, and it's a win hydrologically. So we have some partners that we work with. Nature Conservancy is one of them, working on this. And then if land is developed, try to keep the existing surface water rights tied to that land and use that for the lawn and landscaping so that you sort of break even on the surface water use. And that's becoming standard now as municipalities in Idaho expand and annex previously irrigated ag land. That's pretty well known how to do this now, and the cities are doing this, and they just make sure they get the water rights when they annex the land, and they have dual systems. There's one for culinary water, and then there's this other one for the landscaping. Of course, if you want to make all this work, you really have to reduce consumptive use. Otherwise, you're just trading one thing for another. And so the conservation groups that I work with are really trying to figure out how to do this. Changes in crop types and rotations have the potential to buy a little bit of water here and there. For example, fall grain versus spring. That's a strategy we found will save a little bit of water. Market-based exchanges from senior users on low-value lands. These would be senior users in the headwater areas where the growing season isn't that long. try to get that water to the junior groundwater users downstream on the high value croplands, and the mechanism to do that is managed aquifer recharge. Then, of course, developed lands, climate appropriate landscaping can help. And what we found in our organization is that this is requiring new partnerships that we've never explored before, which is, fully integrating water users, agribusiness, nonprofit organizations and agencies that do this. And then the last thing here is, I mentioned this earlier, that it's kind of hard right now in our current administrative landscape to exchange and lease water and to make managed recharge really do what we want it to do. And there's a bunch of procedures that would benefit both agricultural producers and conservation interests. And actually, I should throw the cities in there, because the cities actually in Idaho are under the same curtailment order and settlement agreement as the agricultural groundwater users. So they're partners in all this as well, because they'll run out of water if they don't figure out some way to mitigate via managed recharge or some of these exchanges. So item 5 is a place that we're working on. We have a ways to go to get administrative rules to where we can actually do items 1 through 4. I think that's it. I couldn't have a slide presentation without a potato field. So this is a efficiently irrigated potato field just east of Ashton here, probably a mile from my office here. So I think that's everything I had. Wyatt,
that's great.
What do you want to do
next?
Thanks
so much. Thank you, Rob. That was really, really helpful. We can get on to questions if people have them, but before we do, I just wanted to say that if you want to sign off, we will be sending out more information soon about logistics for the meeting in Helena on March 7th. And we're also going to send out a few questions to the group to consider for that meeting, and the things that will help us improve the agenda for that meeting. So expect to see something from us soon. But yeah, if there are any questions, now would be the time. Thanks again, Rob.
You're welcome. I think I unshared my screen there, so I don't know if you have something else to throw up there, or if it matters.
We'll just leave it like that.
Okay. No questions?
It's always hard to break the ice here.
Or can I not hear them?
Yeah.
We have one here, Wyatt.
Oh, Rob, this is Aaron. I was just wondering, you didn't present any trends and changes in irrigated lands over the last 50 years. Are you assuming that there's been no increase in irrigated lands in Idaho, and all that increase in consumption or reduction of flow is just strictly due to changes in increased efficiency?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question regards how much actual new land has come into production. And so in surface irrigated areas, there is no new land that's been added as formal places of use attached to the water rights. So administratively, no. However, as I mentioned, if a water user has, say, 1,000 acres that goes with a water right, and water supply has prevented him from irrigating the full 1,000, and now he can, that in a sense is increased acreage, but it's not increased in the administrative sense. So there is some of that, certainly. With respect to the groundwater, most of the new groundwater irrigated ground that was added to the system was added between, say, 1955 and the mid-70s. And so, yeah, there was quite a bit of expansion of actual land in production during that, say, 25-year time frame up till into the 80s. And then since then, there's been no increase in that because of the groundwater moratorium. So yeah, there was expansion of land quite a bit in that 50s and 60s. Since the mid 70s, early 80s, it's been fairly flat administratively. And then of course there's just this issue of more thorough irrigation, if you will, of land that was already assigned as place of use to existing surface water rights. So yeah, there's been some expansion of land, but most of it occurred, back in the 60s, 50s, and 60s.
Rob, this is Ann, and I have a question. In Idaho, do you guys does it require a change in water right application if you change your irrigation methodology? So when you go from flood to pivot?
Yeah, so there's no change required for a change in conveyance, application method, or anything like that. There are changes required if you change the point of diversion, and that actually happens quite often when efficiency is installed, because a lot of these areas traditionally have diverted water from headwater streams, and the canal, was like 20 miles long or something. And when a more efficient system goes in, they can just pump the water directly out of the creek, pump it up the hill, put it in a pipeline, so they can move the point of diversion, 20 miles or something, and take the same amount of water to irrigate the same land. So there's quite a bit of that that's done, changing the point of diversion, and that does require a formal change to the water right. But in terms of changing the technology, there's nothing required. On that note, though, it's worth pointing out that managed aquifer recharge, of course, wasn't a beneficial use that was recognized, when in the 19th century when these rights were claimed. And there currently is not an easy way to add managed aquifer recharge as a beneficial use to an irrigation right. So that's why the managed recharge rights are junior, because people had to just start over in the priority system under the with a managed recharge as a beneficial use. That's been one of the administrative things that a few people have tried to change. There is some movement in that direction to add managed aquifer recharge to these senior rights that were claimed for irrigation, but so far that hasn't really gained a lot of traction, but it's something that people are working on. So that's kind of a related issue to change in the water right.
Yeah, interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Rob, this is Chuck. I wanted to follow up on that. Most of the, as we learned in recent U.S. Supreme Court litigation with Wyoming over violations of the Yellowstone River Compact, where we had raised as one of the issues Wyoming's conversion from flood to sprinkler in the Tongue River Basin, and Montana experiencing up to 30% reduction in water supply. We found out that I think all the western states under the change application process can evaluate effects of changes on the hydrologic system related to the point of diversion, the place of use, or the beneficial use, but there is no provision for evaluating the effects of increased consumptive use. And that, from a legal perspective, downstream users affected by the conversion simply have to live with it.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's certainly what the answer has been here in Idaho. Essentially, is that the water right's about diverting water from the river, and if a greater portion of that is used consumptively now, too bad for the other folks. Yeah, that's pretty much how that's gone.
Hi, Rob. This is Joel Cahoon. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I wanted to thank you for doing a good job on that presentation, and also for at the right points putting in comments like in our basin, because clearly the result of changes to irrigation systems on a basin depend heavily on what's going on in that basin. And so, for example, I've worked in some systems in the Midwest where you would be hard-pressed to find any negative effect of increases in irrigation efficiency, and those basins tend to be largely groundwater sourced with no and very little surface water to be found or to interact with. And then on the flip side of that, in New Mexico, some basins that are entirely diverted out of the Rio Grande would suffer horrible consequences by any change to the on-farm irrigation practices. Another thought is that some systems, the motivation for reducing leaching through the root zone was water quality based, and the results were very positive. And those positive effects of reduced leaching of agrochemicals far outweighed any negative effect on the hydrology on the top end. And again, that also depends on the crop, the system, the climate, all of these factors, but they should be thought of, I think, in the same light.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment about water quality. That's just something I didn't address at all, other than in water temperature moderation, through groundwater flow. But yeah, water quality is a much bigger issue in other places than it is here. And you're right, absolutely, that changes in efficiency there could be very positive in terms of changes, improvements in water quality. And yeah, absolutely on the groundwater issue, if you're in a groundwater irrigated system, efficiency is always going to be a good thing in those situations for sure. And yeah, absolutely, the local hydrogeology, soil type, soil chemistry, crop type, all that stuff is really important. I'm glad you brought up the Rio Grande example. So yeah, there are these general overarching principles, hydrogeology, land type, crop type. These are the things you need to assess, but the results of the assessment are going to come out different in every different kind of basin.
Rob, hey, this is Wyatt. I don't know if you can see. There's a question from Jeanette written in there. I can just read it out.
Let's see.
Basically, it just says, "Great talk, Rob."
Okay, got that.
In the slide regarding paradox efficiency of the 3 items listed, which of those may relate to changes in policy?
Okay, so the 3 items were first just increased yield per acre at the farm scale. That's probably not going to be a policy type issue. The one about the forfeiture clause and lack of incentive to do anything but divert your whole right, that's got a policy element for sure. The definition of beneficial use could be evaluated differently if the so-called duty of water was 5 feet in 1890 because you lost half the water to get it to the field, and the duty of water now is 2.5 feet. There's definitely a basis in prior appropriation law to make some changes there on what actually constitutes beneficial use, especially if the place of use stays the same, tied to that right. In theory, there's sort of a maximum amount of ET that could be produced, and if the water rights for more than that, then I think you could make a case, and people have, to change policy there. And then, of course, there's this sort of broader policy. I guess that's more of an administrative legal issue than it is policy. I think it's the 3rd item that's really got the policy implications, and that is, you know, if a producer can save water, quote unquote save, not need, if you will, a certain amount of water, how can you prevent that water from just being diverted by the next downstream user? And of course, under prior appropriation, that's the whole point. If the senior doesn't use it, the junior gets it. But that's probably the single biggest place where policy changes could make a difference in providing some kind of incentive or you know, mechanism by which the producer installing the efficiency can say, yeah, I don't need this extra 50 CFS, and that water can go somewhere else where it has some larger, you know, benefit to, I don't know, aquatic resources, whatever the regional stakeholders determine as a better use for that water. That's probably the single biggest policy element versus just sort of the details of how beneficial use is interpreted.
Yeah, very interesting talk. Enjoyed it. On your graph where you have the cumulative volume change, pre-1916 or whatever, do you think that that's due to measurement abilities, or is that part of a larger long-term cyclical trend in groundwater? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we argue about that one all the time, as you might imagine. So yeah, first of all, just the data available to construct that graph, you know, they're reasonably good back to about 1910. In fact, the gauge record on that King Hill gauge at the downstream end of our basin is 1910, and the gauge on the Snake River coming in, you know, out of Wyoming into the Idaho side here, that gauge goes back to 1910. So we're pretty good on information that's used to construct the water budget, water in, water out, back to 1910. But there's a good 40 years of irrigation that went on prior to 1910. So that graph necessarily just starts at 1910, and we just called that zero because we didn't know what happened prior to that. And so the volume change is relative to 1910 or 12 or whatever that first year is. There's probably a lot of stuff that went on before that, some due to climate and some due to the fact that agriculture was being developed as early as, you know, the 1860s here. So there's certainly a lot of stuff that went on before that we don't know. So the reference point is 1912. We don't know what happened before that. A lot of times we argue about it because there's some water rights that date to like 1905 that have been part of these water calls. And so that's an issue. And then, of course, you saw the response to climate in the descent off that 1955 peak, where wet years and dry years are clearly discernible in the aquifer itself. So there's no question that part of the variability we see is due to climate. In fact, what was it, two years ago, we had a very unusually large amount of snow on the plain itself. It's really rare, but there was like, you know, 10 inches of water equivalent or something out there, which is just unheard of. 10 inches of snow, which is, you know, an inch of water equivalent. And then it rained on it, and so we got a bonus, you know, 500,000 acre feet of recharge that you usually don't get. So there's a lot of climate signal in there as well. And who knows what happened before 1910? We just didn't have the gauging.
All right, any final questions? Okay. Great. I think we'll leave it at that. Once again, thank you so much, Rob, for your time. We look forward to seeing you at the next part of this. And to the group, we'll be sending out more information soon about the next meeting in Helena. So thanks, everybody, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Wyatt, is there anything else you want to follow up on now?
Nothing specific, Rob. Maybe we'll gather our thoughts and then get back to you probably pretty soon.
Okay. Great.
So much, Rob.
No doubt. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's fun, obviously, for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. Well, we'll be in touch. And sorry I can't make that meeting on March 7th, but for sure in April.
That's okay. Yeah, we'll loop you in as best we can along the way. So thanks again.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
thanks, Rob.
Thank you.